Bonjour à tous, bienvenue au Théâtre national de la presse. Welcome to the National Press Theatre. Je suis Daniel Thibault, président de la tribune de la presse. Nous sommes en compagnie ce matin de gens du Conseil des Canadiens, Peggy Walsh-Craig, Gary Neal, et Stephen Schreibman pour parler de la suite des choses à la suite du décision de la Cour fédérale la semaine dernière. Je vous demanderai de fermer vos téléphones cellulaires ou de les mettre sur vibration, s'il vous plaît. Take it away.
Good morning. Thank you very much. Bonjour. My name is Gary Neal, Executive Director of the Council of Canadians, Canada's largest social justice organization with roughly 75,000 supporters from coast to coast to coast. With me today is Peggy Walsh-Craig from North Bay, one of the applicants in the riding of Nipissing to Miskaming, and Stephen Schreibman, a public interest lawyer from the firm Sack Goldblatt Mitchell, lawyer for the applicants in the so-called robocalls cases. Je m'appelle Gary Neal et je suis directeur exécutif du Conseil des Canadiens, qui est le plus important organisme de la société civile et compte 75 000 adhérents d'un rive à l'autre à l'autre. À mes côtés aujourd'hui, il y a Peggy Walsh-Craig de North Bay et Stephen Schreibman du cabinet d'avocats Sack Goldblatt Mitchell. Je regrette qu'aucun des intervenants de ce panel ne parle assez bien français pour faire des commentaires ou pour répondre aux questions en français. Cependant, du fait que les questions légales sont extrêmement sensibles et nuancées, nous allons devoir faire ces présentations en anglais. At a press conference on March 27, 2012, I announced that electors in 7 ridings were challenging the results of the 2011 federal election because fraudulent calls misdirecting voters to the wrong polling stations had suppressed the voter turnout in these ridings and affected the results. At the time, I said this: we believe that through these court actions, all Canadians will find out exactly what happened and who was responsible. As a result of last week's decision by the Honorable Justice Richard Mosley of the Federal Court, we now know definitively what happened. There was widespread fraudulent calling, and the data used to make the calls came from the Conservative Party of Canada Central Database. As Andrew Coyne said, we now have the smoking gun, and in a few moments I will tell you what the Council of Canadians intends to do to find out who pulled the trigger. First, I will invite Peggy to say a few words.
Well over a year ago, I agreed to become an applicant in this landmark case. I did so because I was appalled that someone tried to manipulate the May 2011 federal election in my riding and elsewhere through the use of fraudulent telephone calls. At the time, the Conservatives were denying that these calls took place anywhere other than Guelph, but I knew from personal experience that that was not the case. I feel completely vindicated by the ruling. In fact, the problem was far larger than we originally thought. We now know that tens of thousands of Canadians received calls like I received, misdirecting them to wrong polling locations, and that many Canadians had their votes stolen in the process. While the results were not overturned in my riding, that is far less important than exposing the roots of what is now acknowledged as a widespread problem and making sure that this never happens again. That is why I and my fellow applicants, with the advice of our lawyer, have decided not to appeal the decision to the Supreme Court of Canada. I feel that we have taken this case as far as it can go. We want to thank the Council of Canadians and thousands of individual donors across the country who contributed to the legal fees.
Thank you, Peggy. What the Honorable Justice Mosley found as facts include these. Widespread fraudulent calling happened in the 41st general election, not just in the riding of Guelph and the 6 ridings involved in the court applications, but in many others as well. The purpose of these live and recorded calls, claiming to be from Elections Canada advising of changes in polling locations, was to discourage citizens from voting. The calls were targeted at voters who had identified themselves earlier in the campaign as being non-supporters of the Conservative Party of Canada. They were effective and they discouraged many people from voting. The polling data from ECOS research was accepted as providing relevant evidence by Justice Mosley. When you correlate it with other polls conducted by Forum Research and Ipsos Reid, one can readily conclude that at least 1% of eligible voters did not vote in 2011 because they received one of these fraudulent calls. While that might seem like an inconsequential number, I would point out that 1% of the total electorate in May 2011 was 242,575 Canadians. And finally, Justice Mosley found as fact that the most likely source of the data used to make those calls was the Constituency Information Management System, CIMS, which is the central database of the Conservative Party of Canada. In other words, Justice Mosley concluded there was a centrally managed and widespread campaign of voter suppression, and that CIMS was likely accessed for this purpose by, quote, a person or persons unknown to the court at this time. If Conservative Party spokesperson Fred Delory really believes that a federal court decision which points to his party's tightly controlled central database as a source of the data used to make tens of thousands of fraudulent telephone calls, which constituted electoral fraud in an unprecedented voter suppression campaign unlike anything we have seen in Canadian history, then he and I have fundamentally different views about what it means to have a free and fair election in Canada. Canadians are quite rightly outraged at what happened. Commentators of all political stripes are expressing concerns about what this means for our political system. There is strong agreement that we need two outcomes to this scandal. One, identify the perpetrator or perpetrators of the voter suppression campaign in 2011 and hold them to account. And two, ensure it never happens again. For reasons Peggy has explained, the applicants have decided there will not be an appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada. And, as we have throughout this process, we support their decision. A Supreme Court appeal can achieve neither of the outcomes that Canadians want and need. The Conservative Party of Canada refused to step forward during the court process to explain who downloaded lists of non-CPC supporters in the days leading up to and on Election Day in May 2011. They refused to cooperate with Elections Canada despite being advised prior to the election about possible fraudulent calling. An appeal to the Supreme Court won't get us any closer to knowing who it was that had access to the central database and the authority to spend money on both live and recorded voter suppression calls. Nor can the Supreme Court ensure that such a campaign never happens again. So it is time to change tack. Les demandeurs n'interjetteront pas appel devant la Cour suprême de Canada. La Cour ne peut trouver les responsables de la fraude électorale de 2011, ni empêcher qu'une telle fraude se reproduise à l'avenir. Nous demanderons également au gouvernement du Canada de déposer une loi électorale plus sévère. Nous invitons tout le monde à signer la pétition sur notre site web at canadians.org. Today we are making the following demand of the Prime Minister. By the end of the current sitting of Parliament, we demand that you, 1, establish an official public inquiry that will get to the bottom of the voter suppression campaign that the government can no longer deny took place in the May 2011 federal election. And 2, table electoral reform legislation that incorporates the recommendations of Elections Canada, but goes further by establishing enforceable standards for the conduct of political parties and enhances the ability of individual voters like Peggy to challenge election results that have been obtained through fraud or corrupt or illegal practices. These steps are the only way to ensure this never happens again. We intend to keep the pressure on. We are determined to ensure that there is accountability for the fraud that took place during the 41st general election. Today, the Council of Canadians has launched our Democracy 24/7 petition, and we are calling on Canadians across the country, across political stripes, and across generations to sign it at Canadians.org. The petition calls for a public inquiry into the scandal and for comprehensive legislative changes. What has become clear in these legal cases, as well as during Elections Canada's investigations, is that senior Conservative Party of Canada officials must be compelled to testify about the use of Sims to defraud Canadian electors. When this scandal first came to light, Prime Minister Harper said he wanted to get to the bottom of what happened. Other cabinet ministers and Conservative MPs continue to this day to parrot that same line. But the facts as determined by Justice Mosley and the comments of Chief Electoral Officer Marc Mayrand reveal something far different. The Conservative Party has been uncooperative from the beginning. They have refused to make records available and to be interviewed. And the respondent MPs in the legal cases engaged in what Justice Mosley described as, quote, trench warfare to prevent the facts from coming out. We are determined to find a way to compel senior officials to give evidence under oath about who was responsible. Before concluding, I want to thank the applicants. These are individual Canadians who stepped forward to defend the right of all Canadians to a free and fair election. I want to thank all of our witnesses, some of whom, like Frank Graves, were subjected to scurrilous and totally unwarranted personal attacks. I want to thank the thousands of Council of Canadian members and individual donors across the country who generously contributed towards the applicants' legal costs, and without whom these landmark cases could never have proceeded. I want to thank also Stephen's firm, Sack Goldblatt Mitchell, who have generously contributed to the efforts by significantly discounting fees and doing extraordinary work in the last year. And finally, I want to thank Justice Richard Mosley for his careful and considered decision. Being able to participate in elections is at the very heart of our democracy. It is a fundamental right enjoyed by every Canadian, and it is protected by law. Someone deprived thousands of Canadians of that right during the May 2011 federal election, and we remain determined to find out who was responsible and to make sure it never happens again. We would be happy to answer any questions.
All right, you know the drill. Une question, une sous-question. Vous levez votre main. On commence avec Stéphanie Marac de la Presse canadienne.
Hello. You said you felt compelled to find a way to force senior officials of the Conservative Party to testify under oath and find all the facts that you were not able to get during the trial. How do you think you're going to be able to do that?
We're exploring a number of different possibilities in this regard. We first of all think that the simplest solution would be for the government to hold a public inquiry into the matter. There's certainly enough evidence, enough facts that are now on the table to justify holding a public inquiry, and that public inquiry would of course be able to subpoena witnesses and to force them to testify under oath as to what happened. So that's the first and the priority that we're examining at the moment.
Okay, that would be the most simple way, but is it feasible considering the trench warfare that was experienced during the first trial?
We are a citizens organization. We're an organization of activists. We have tens of thousands of members across the country. On this campaign, we have had support from people in all political parties. We have donors who have given us substantial amounts of money, and they've said, you know, I don't agree with what you do generally, but on this one I absolutely support you. We're convinced that we're going to see tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Canadians stepping up saying, we have to get to the bottom of this. It's now findings of fact, and we need to find out who is responsible. And we're convinced that that kind of public campaign can make a difference.
Lina Dim, CP.
Still on the same topic, I don't quite understand though what's your leverage here. Besides a petition, what exactly do you have in hand, or eventually you'll have in hand?